Hey guys, welcome to the garden here at Roots Refuge Farm. If you're new here, my name is Jess and I'm so glad you're here. And if you're not new here, I am also really glad that you're here. It's a little windy today, so hopefully our sound is okay. I've got a cup of tea and I have this big tote full of books that I want to discuss with you. This is something that does get asked a lot, like, hey, what books do you like to read? And I love to read. I'm an avid reader. I have been since I was a child, and that has required some choices in the very busy life that I currently lead. I do listen to a lot of audiobooks, which allows me to continue reading and listening to stories, even though I do a lot of things obviously where my hands are busy. So with gardening, audiobooks are kind of a great middle ground, but I still actually do read a lot of paper books. I've just made a choice that instead of scrolling social media when I'm in a waiting room, or when I drop my kid off for guitar and I've got 25 minutes to burn, I take a book with me, and that is how I still read paper books. I do listen to more audiobooks at this point than I read paper books, just because I can get through them faster. I spend a lot more time working with my hands than sitting around waiting. Even still, will people say, how do you have time to read? I think that in many cases we're able to make more time than we realize for the things that are important to us. Now, I love that we live in an age that if you're interested in homesteading and gardening, there's just a ton of free information available to you. It's fantastic that even though we might not have anybody in our real life that has interest or experience in gardening and homesteading, through the internet we're able to connect with the community and experience a neighbor that you can ask a question about your cow or your tomato plant or different things like that. Community is very, very important, but books are also very important measures of information, because if something were to happen and you did not have access to getting on the internet, what books you have, what written information you have would be very important. In my years of homesteading, I have amassed quite a library of all kinds of topics: permaculture and homesteading, preservation, fermenting, lots of cookbooks. Also, obviously, I read a lot of fiction novels as well, and I'll probably do that in a separate video if you guys are interested in talking about fiction novels. But today I wanted to bring up some books that I think would benefit pretty much anybody to read. Some of these books are maybe out of print, and therefore you could buy them used, you could look for them used. When I was first interested in homesteading, I had a really small budget, and I would go and just read. I read every book that the library had on homesteading and gardening. That was me turning my waiting room into a classroom. I encourage you guys to do that. If you're in the place where you're dreaming of the homestead life, getting as much information up here as you can while you're waiting is going to mean that whenever you actually get the opportunity to apply the knowledge that you have, you'll make a lot less mistakes, and you'll be ready to go. You won't have to start learning when you first get your opportunity. You'll already have learned a lot. For me, at this point, being 10 years in and having this large homestead where we grow lots of our food, I still go back to these books and I read them for instruction. I still check recipes and learn how to do different things, but largely for inspiration. Because of the cyclical nature of the homesteading life, we're doing the same things over and over again, year after year. A lot of this, it gets a little bit monotonous in a beautiful way, and I've really learned to embrace it. But sometimes going back to these books and reading it, especially with the lens of remembrance of when this was new and this was the deepest desire of my heart, it gives me such fuel to come and tackle the hard work of this life. So I've got a little bit of a lot of things here. I've got several books. I will start by saying I've written 2 books. I think they're quite good. The first one is called The First Time Gardener, Growing Vegetables. The second one is called The First Time Homesteader by Jess, so that's me. And in doing this video, I realized I do not actually have a copy of either one of my books. I've given them all away. And they're available wherever books are sold, and many libraries have them. Now, I like both of my books. I'm fond of both of them. The First Time Gardener was my first one, so I think I'm especially fond of it. But it is meant for brand new gardeners, so people who are just getting into it. And I've had lots of people tell me that they'd gardened for a long time and still learned things in that book, which is a great compliment to me. But it covers from beginning to end, like starting seeds or buying plants and planting and care, maintenance, pest control organically, harvesting, all of that, as well as a lot of encouragement, which is what I have found a lot of first-time gardeners really need. And then the First-Time Homesteader is really the book that I wrote for 22-year-old me that was sitting in bookstores flipping through books that I couldn't afford to buy. I wrote an overview of for a person who is like thinking about or just getting into homesteading and thinking about, do I want to do cows? Do I want to have goats? Do I want to raise meat? What do I want to do here? And it's sort of the overview, talking about what to look for in land, talking about some really basic permaculture principles, as well as the encouragement that I find that people really need. So both of those, I have to mention those because obviously when I thought, what would I write for a brand new person into this lifestyle, I could point at other books, but that's exactly what I would tell you, because I wrote it. But these other books I'm talking about today are also very good and more extensive. I would say these books are not necessarily introduction books, though I think new people could enjoy them. So I'm going to start in the kitchen because all of you have access to a kitchen. You might not have much of a garden yet. You might not be able to homestead yet, but you probably have access to a kitchen, and that is one of, my opinion, the greatest places that you can turn your waiting room into a classroom is by learning kitchen skills, because you're going to need them, because whenever you do start growing your own food, it comes in ingredients. My kids say that whenever they want something snacky, my teenagers are going to the fridge, they're going to the pantry, Mom, there's nothing to eat. And I'm like, our house is quite literally full of food. We have so much food, and all we have is ingredients, and it makes me laugh, but it's true. When you homestead, the food comes in ingredients, and it takes somebody knowing what to do with the ingredients to make it accessible snacks, meals, and easier to use stuff. So one of the first books that I would recommend is Nourishing Traditions by Sally Fallon. This is kind of a homestead staple, and you'll see this book referenced a lot. This is a very extensive book. I mean, obviously this is a ton of information. It has a lot of teaching about nourishing food and what makes nourishing food nourishing, but it also has a lot of recipes. So one of the things I really like about this is that it is using whole foods. This whole book, the recipes are using whole foods, which, as a person who just grows ingredients, that's a benefit to me. When I get a cookbook and it has a whole lot of stuff that I have to go buy because it's specifically, the recipes are written with packaged or processed foods, that doesn't help me, because that's not helping me use what I grow. And ultimately, if I'm reading a cookbook right now, I'm trying to have inspiration and instruction to use what I grow. And so even if you're not growing food yet, learning to cook from whole foods will prepare you so that when you are growing food, you don't feel overwhelmed by it. So I like Nourishing Traditions. It's really taught me a lot about understanding just a healthy approach to food, and this is a good one to start with. The only other cookbooks I brought out here were these by Nigel Slater. Let me see, I've got a few of them. I actually have a few more of his cookbooks, but they're all very large and heavy, so I only brought these out. My friend April gave me my first Nigel Slater cookbook, I don't know, some years ago. She watched my channel and reached out and shared a letter and sent me this book, and we've actually become good friends. But I love his cookbooks. Some of them are a little harder to find. He has several, and some of them you probably have to buy used, like some of mine I bought used. But he's a gardener, and he's an excellent writer. If you're the kind of person who likes to read a cookbook, like I do, I actually will take a cookbook and lay in bed and read it after I've eaten. Don't do it when you're hungry. I don't suggest that. But he has a beautiful poetic way of writing, which of course I appreciate that. But he's a gardener and he grows food, and that makes his cookbooks so much more applicable to what I'm doing here. Because like for here, he has this one, it's called Tender, A Cook in His Vegetable Patch. And it's separated out by the type of plant. So here's like peppers, and this whole section is recipes for peppers. And it's not just basic recipes, there's also little musings and different things like that. I highly suggest, if you're wanting books that inspire you to use what you're growing in your garden, find books by people who are gardening. Like cookbooks by people who are actively growing food are going to be so much easier to use, because they're going to be more seasonal. for instance, like with the Nigel Slater cookbooks, a lot of his recipes are using multiple things that grow at the same time. That's been a struggle for me with a lot of cookbooks as I open them, and you know, I'm looking for tomato recipes because it's the height of summer, and I'm finding recipes that have a lot of things like kale or cabbage or things that don't grow where I live when the tomatoes are growing. So to find cookbooks that are really seasonal can be kind of difficult, but I really love Nigel Slater's cookbooks because I feel like these recipes are inspiring, it's easy to use, and it's applicable to the food growing lifestyle. Alright, from there, let's talk about gardening. So this book, I think everybody could benefit from reading this book. It's a pretty small one. It's a little bit older. This is Ruth Stout's book. Let's see. It was published in 1961. So Ruth Stout was kind of the pioneer of a lot of the things that are currently more common in gardening. No dig, and the way that we plant potatoes is kind of modified from Ruth Stout's method, where she literally just put the potatoes on the ground and just piled straw on top of them. We do actually mound under them, so it's a little different. But I really enjoy her book because when I read this early in gardening for me, it did free me up a lot. And I try to convey that exact feeling to you guys, like, hey, it wants to grow, it wants to work. You don't have to make it so hard. It doesn't have to be so difficult. Her book is called Gardening Without Work for the Aging, the Busy, and the Indolent. So there you go. I enjoyed this. I think it's a really great book for people who are getting into gardening, and especially if you are feeling uptight, if you are feeling stressed, or if you really are just saying, I need to be able to do this with less intense work. She talks about different methods that are easy to apply. Okay, from there, let's talk about this book. The Wartime Kitchen and Garden, The Home Front, 1939 to 1945. This is by Jennifer Davies. So there is a show that I've mentioned multiple times that I love to watch. It was a BBC show. I think it came out in the 90s, maybe the 80s, called The Wartime Kitchen and Garden. And this was actually sent to me by a viewer. I'm not sure that this book is still in print. This might be one that you'd have to look for used or in a library or something like that. But this was written by the associate producer of the BBC show, The Victorian Kitchen, The Victorian Kitchen Garden, The Victorian Flower Garden, and The Wartime Kitchen and Garden. All of those shows are awesome, and many of them are available to watch. So I know I'm talking about books, but those shows are really inspiring as well as far as growing food. And I have a real deep fascination with World War II and the victory gardens and the way that people had to kind of rise up to survive rationing and shortages, and essentially to carry England through the war, because at the onset of the war the country was only growing like 60% of its food, and of course their import ships were being sunk and all of these different things, so the whole country had to kind of rise up and grow food. I remember reading that they actually tore out the ornamental gardens at a lot of the major universities to plant food in order to be able to get through the war. And I find that very fascinating. Of course, being born in the 80s here in the United States, I've never lived through the absolute necessity to have a garden. But as a gardener, that's kind of always there in the back of your mind. You feel like you have so much freedom when you have a garden. And reading stuff like this makes me realize that that's not as far away as it feels like. You know, that the possibility of really needing to rely on the food that you grow, it's not an impossible thing. So this book is cool to me in a history sense because, you know, just reading like wartime eggless sponge cake, the different recipes they came up with to be very resourceful. But it also has a lot of cool preservation tips. It shows a lot of the different like posters and the different things that were put up, information that was given to people to make do with what they had. And for me, I think that diving into history like this benefits us as gardeners and homesteaders, because I think that it's very easy to give up on the hard work of the garden when you walk into Walmart and the food that you're working so hard to grow in your garden is there for 98 cents a pound. Now, I know prices have gone up a lot, and so that's giving people a necessity of needing to grow, but even still, it's hard to push through whenever you can just go buy it at the store. And for me, when I read stuff like this, it kind of helps me detach myself a little bit from the fact that the store is there, and attach myself a little bit to the idea that I do have this freedom, and I do have this sustainability, and I do have this growing right here that I don't have to depend on anybody else for. So I really suggest this. This is a great book. I actually, this is one of the ones that I go to frequently whenever I just want to sit down and look through something and feel a little inspired. All right, next in the realm of inspiration, Kiss the Ground by Josh Tickell, I don't really know. He is the film director who created the documentary Kiss the Ground. Another thing, if you prefer watching stuff on the TV, it's a really great documentary to kind of wrap your head around what's going on in our culture and the way agriculture is affecting the earth. Again, it adds validity and importance to the things that we're doing as far as trying to localize food. And it's easy, again, to feel like your little garden maybe doesn't make that big of a difference, and it wouldn't be that big of a deal if you quit. But I feel like having information like this gives us, it empowers us to say, no, this actually is making a difference for me to have food in my yard. This is a good book. It goes over a lot of what the documentary goes over. There's more information in this book than is in the documentary. Lots of interviews and kind of talking about what's happening to the soil and the earth. And I highly suggest reading this one, no matter where you are. If you're in your classroom, if you've been homesteading for years, I think this is a great book to read. Now, the last two that I have here, this is going to be more for people who are looking to actually apply some things to their homestead. Definitely could read these while you're waiting. I know not everybody's trying to homestead. The first one is, this is Joel Salatin's newish book. I think it came out like a 1.5 years or so ago, called Polyface Micro: Success with Livestock on a Homestead Scale. I really like reading Joel's books because he's very conversational. Sometimes permaculture and homesteading books are very scientific, and they don't read easy. They read more like textbooks, and I prefer a more casual read personally. Just how I process information, I like that better. You probably could guess that by how I present information. It's more casual and conversational because that's just how I process. And I really like this book because Joel is very conversational in it, but you're getting a lot of information. It's funny, it's light, but tons of information as far as applying different permaculture principles, as well as some marketing, but largely on a homestead scale, the things that Joel does on a homestead scale, which I think is really awesome. So if you're thinking about doing homesteading, I've read multiple of Joel's books, but this one is my favorite one for what we do. You know, a lot of the books are more towards marketing or scaling large, and this is towards scaling small, which I think applies to more people. So this is a really good one. And then the last one, this is actually a textbook, and there is a very large version of this. This is Bill Mollison's book, Introduction to Permaculture. There's a large version of this. It's like $100 and something. This one is more introductory. It's smaller, and it's cheaper. But if you wanted to really dive into permaculture, this is the text that is used by many permaculture certification courses. And if you wanted to really dive in, I would skip this one and buy the big fat one. I have it in the house, but as far as for the sake of this video for introduction, this one is cheaper and maybe a little easier to digest. So this is, Bill Mollison is kind of like one of the granddaddies of permaculture. So a lot of modern day certifications are taught on his teaching and his principles. The thing with permaculture is that it's a lot of it's common sense. A lot of it is very basic, and the permaculture world can be a little bit overwhelming for people who are getting into homesteading. And I didn't get into homesteading with a lick of concern about permaculture at all. I had a very romantic idea of farm life. I wanted a chicken coop, I wanted cows, I wanted all those things. The idea of stewarding the soil and growing the grass and really engaging with the relationships as a whole, which is what permaculture is, was not on my radar. We began learning that honestly because of dealing with the problems that arise by not thinking of the relationships as a whole, you know, like dealing with goats getting sick because we had too many on a small pasture, dealing with chickens not laying because it was too muddy where they were, and obviously we weren't at that point moving them. And permaculture kind of brought solutions to the problems that we ran into trying to do things in a more like modern and conventional way. If you are interested in learning some permaculture principles, I think that this is a really good place to start. There's also another book called Gaia's Garden, G-A-I-A-S Garden, and I looked for my copy of it, and it's a lot of the same information with maybe some more photos. This has a lot of drawings in it. Both of these are good places to start. I think I must have given my copy away because I couldn't find it on my shelf. The thing that I want to encourage you, if you do dive off into this information, is to know that it's okay for applying stuff like this to take years. Learning the principles, applying them a little at a time, and gearing towards a goal of doing something. Because for a lot of people, you've already started, you've already got some stuff built, and some of the things that are going to be taught in permaculture may be contradictory to what you already have going. Well, you don't have to tear everything down and start over. Just start applying one step at a time. For us, that's what we're doing. I mean, we're just applying these principles a little at a time with the goal of applying them a lot once we have everything in place how we want it. And I don't necessarily think that I would, for brand new people who are like, hey, I'm thinking about growing food, that I would throw them into this. But for the people who are asking me, hey, where are you learning permaculture? Where do I start with that? This is a really good place to start. Obviously, that's a random smattering of books. There wasn't really any one focus other than the fact that I knew I wanted to shoot a video to say, because people have asked me recently, what kind of books do you suggest? And as I was looking at my bookshelves, I thought if I had a person who was getting started in this, really wanting to sink their teeth into something and learn and be able to say, oh, I like this, but I don't want to apply that, or oh, this is good, but, you know, willing to actually take in a lot of information and apply it where they felt comfortable, this was the collection of books that I decided to choose. Another thing that I will tell you, in this world of free information, if you have a printer, print stuff off. Like if you find yourself referencing a website that has a recipe, print it off, put it in a binder. Start your own homesteading and cookbook. Start your own book of information where you are collecting information from other places. I've got a binder full of recipes and articles. I've been in Facebook groups where they have charts available for the members to use, where they have dosing for goat medicines, that one file that was dosing for goat medicines, and I referenced that thing no less than 45 times whenever I was keeping my goats, and I finally was like, why don't I just print this off and put it in my binder? And that way you're not dependent on getting on your phone or getting on the internet in order to have the information that you need. For me, in my binder, I have lots of things printed off. I have notebook paper, so that if I am reading a book of something like this and I want to write down something that I learned, I just write it down so I have the information repeated somewhere else. And I always reference that I found it on this book, on this page, so that if I want to go deeper into it, I can, but that particular idea that I wanted to save is there. If there's a particular recipe in a book, I just copy it out into my binder, handwritten, and I'll reference in my binder where I got it, so if I want to check for more information or whatever I can. But I think that we've gotten a little spoiled to always having our phone in our pocket, that there's no reason to write that recipe down. There's no reason to save that because we can just look it back up again. But what if that website's not there one day, or what if you don't have access to it? Just write it down. Just take the 5 minutes to make a record so that you have information on your bookshelves that's not going to go anywhere. So that is it for today. I hope that this helps, maybe gives you something to look at, put it on your list, check it out at the library. I'll put links to what I can find of these books online, and I'll put a list of all of the titles and authors in the show notes. So thank you guys for hanging out with me today. God bless you. Until next time.